I still remember the smell before I remember the sound. Wet soil, burnt oil, and that faint sweetness of gunpowder that never really leaves your nostril. It was the kind of morning where the fog clung low to the ground, turning the fields of Normandy into a quiet sea of white. My crew and I were inside our M4 Sherman, Lola, waiting for orders to move up a few hundred yards to cover the infantry advance. We were young, tired, and more scared than any of us would admit. The Germans had been hammering us for 3 days straight from the tree line ahead, and we'd lost 2 tanks already trying to flush them out. They had the high ground, good cover, and a damn fine sense of humour. We'd hear them shouting across the field sometimes, mocking us, calling our Shermans matchboxes. They weren't wrong. Every man in my crew knew that one solid hit from a Panzer IV or, God forbid, a Tiger could turn us into a furnace in seconds. But none of that mattered once the engine roared to life. The sound filled the cabin, drowning out the doubts and the prayers alike. Inside, it was tight, sweltering even in the cold. I could see the faces of my crew through the dim light of the periscope. Harris on the gun, O'Malley loading, and Turner driving. Harris had this nervous tick where he'd tap the breech before every shell, whispering something under his breath. Turner, the youngest of us, had a photo of his fiancée taped near his control panel. He'd look at it every time we stopped, as if to remind himself that someone out there still believed we'd make it home. I envied him for that. I'd stopped believing in things like that months ago. War has a way of hollowing out all the spaces inside you that used to hold faith or dreams. All that's left is duty, fear, and the stubborn will to see the next sunrise. When the order came through the radio, I felt that same jolt I always did, the one that starts in your gut and crawls up your spine. We were to advance through the hedgerow gap, lay suppressing fire on a farmhouse where German spotters were reported, and hold position until the infantry caught up. Easy on paper, suicide in reality. The hedgerows were death traps. Every crossing could hide a Panzer or an 88. Still, I gave Turner the nod, and we rolled forward, the tracks grinding through the mud. The fog thickened, wrapping around us like a curtain. I could hear the engine straining, the metallic groan of the turret as Harris swung it left and right, scanning for movement. Every bump, every shadow made my pulse jump. The air smelled of diesel and fear. Then came the laughter. It echoed faintly from ahead. German voices, loud and mocking. Harris froze. I leaned closer to the periscope and caught a glimpse of a few dark figures near the farmhouse ruins. One of them was waving something, maybe a rag, maybe a signal. And then I saw it, a Tiger tank, half hidden behind the wall, its massive barrel glinting faintly through the mist. They weren't just laughing, they were taunting us. "Sherman!" one of them yelled across the field, followed by more laughter. They knew we could hear them. My mouth went dry. A Tiger could kill us. From twice the distance we could even scratch its armor. But retreat wasn't an option. We were too exposed, and if we backed up, the infantry behind us would be sitting ducks. So I did the only thing that made sense in that insane moment. I told Turner to keep moving forward. "Close the distance," I said. Harris shot me a look like I'd lost my mind, but he didn't argue. The fog worked both ways. If we could get close enough, maybe, just maybe, we'd get a shot that mattered. The laughter died down. Maybe they thought we'd stopped. Maybe they were waiting to finish us with one clean hit. Either way, I wasn't going to die sitting still. I remembered something my old sergeant used to say. If you're scared, move. If you freeze, you're dead. As we crept closer, the Tiger's shape became clearer. Massive, menacing, a beast born to kill tanks like ours. I could feel the weight of every second stretch out. My palms were slick with sweat. I told Harris to hold fire until my mark, and I watched that wall, that cursed wall they were hiding by, waiting for a sign. Then, a flicker, the faint flash of their gun traversing toward us. "Now!" I yelled. The Sherman roared, the gun kicked, and the round smashed straight through the wall. For a heartbeat, everything went silent. Then the wall exploded outward, dust and smoke flying, followed by the gut-deep thunder of a secondary blast. Harris let out a choked laugh, half disbelief, half hysteria. We'd hit something, maybe their ammo rack, maybe pure luck, but it didn't matter. The laughter was gone now. The field was quiet again, except for the engine's steady growl and the sound of our own breathing. That was the first time I realized how fine the line was between fear and courage. You don't feel brave in those moments. You just do what you have to, even if your hands are shaking. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. But that morning, it did. If you're still with me, drop a quick comment. Where are you watching this from? When the smoke began to settle, I remember sitting there for what felt like an eternity. staring through the periscope at the ruin we had just created. The farmhouse wall had collapsed inward, and where the tiger once stood was nothing but blackened wreckage. The explosion had been too strong for just our shell. Something inside it must have cooked off. I could see the flames licking out through the broken stones, reaching toward the sky like angry fingers. Turner exhaled a laugh, short and nervous. Harris just kept whispering, Jesus, like he was trying to convince himself we were still alive. O'Malley, the loader, slammed another shell into the breach even though there was nothing left to shoot at. That's what the mine does out here. It keeps working on autopilot long after the danger's gone. The radio cracked to life, the company commander shouting, asking what in God's name had just happened. I told him the tiger was down. There was a pause, a long one, and then all I heard was disbelief in his voice. You sure? He said. I remember looking back at the burning hulk and thinking how strange it felt to be the one who made that fire. I told him, yes, sir, I'm sure. We moved up a few yards to take cover behind what was left of a stone fence. The infantry started to pour in behind us, helmets low, rifles ready, the way they always did, one foot after the other, silent and tired, but determined. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, looked up at our Sherman and gave us a thumbs up. That small gesture hit me harder than I expected. You don't realize until much later how much a simple sign of life, a nod or a grin, can mean in a place like that. It's not victory you feel, it's relief. Relief that for another day, you're not the one lying face down in the mud. The air smelled of burnt rubber and metal. The fog was gone now, replaced by a thin haze of smoke that drifted over the fields. I climbed out of the hatch, the cool air stinging my face, and for a brief moment, I let myself breathe without the weight of the tank pressing in. My ears rang from the shot, and my hands were still trembling. Harris joined me on the turret, his face pale but grinning. They won't be laughing now, he said. I nodded, though I couldn't find it in me to smile back. Something about it didn't feel like a victory. Maybe because I knew there were men inside that tiger, and now there weren't. Maybe because laughter, once it stops, leaves a kind of silence that sticks to you. As the sun started to break through the smoke, I looked over the field we had crossed, scarred, muddy, littered with debris and tracks. You could almost see the story written in the earth, the advance, the fear, the fire, and then the sudden end. Every field like that had its ghosts. You didn't see them, but you felt them. Sometimes at night, when the engines were off and the guns quiet, I could swear I heard whispers carried by the wind. I told myself it was just the trees or the distant shells, but deep down, I knew better. That night, after the line had been secured, I couldn't sleep. None of us could. We sat around a small fire near the tank, the glow casting long shadows on our faces. Turner pulled out a cigarette and passed it around. Nobody said much. There's not a lot to say when you're trying to make sense of being alive. Harris finally broke the silence. Do you think they ever felt the same? He asked. The Germans, I mean, sitting out there waiting for us, knowing we were coming? I thought about it for a while before answering. Yeah, I said. I think they did, just like us. Scared, hoping they'd see home again. He nodded, and for the first time since the morning, I saw the boy in him again. The kid who probably joined the army thinking it'd be an adventure. War turns boys into men too fast, and men into ghosts even faster. That tiger's wreck burned until dawn. Every now and then, a small explosion would pop from inside, like echoes of a fight that refused to end. I watched it until my eyes stung. Somewhere out there, in that smoke, were men who'd laughed at us hours ago, and part of me couldn't blame them. We laughed too sometimes to hide how terrified we were. In the end, laughter was just another kind of armor. When the first light hit, I saw the field differently. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about surviving one more sunrise. That's what people never understand when they talk about courage. It's not about standing tall or charging forward with pride. It's about shaking hands, aching bones, and still turning the key in the ignition when everything inside you screams not to. That morning, we rolled out again, heading east toward another village. Another fight waiting for us just beyond the horizon. None of us said it, but we all knew it could have gone the other way. It always could. I carried that thought with me long after the war ended, that every breath, every heartbeat was a borrowed one. If you're listening to this and feeling something stir inside you, hit that subscribe button, not for me, but for the memory of all those who never made it back. Their stories deserve to be heard. The next village we hit was called Saint-Martin-sur-Sèvre, just another name on the map back then, but I can still see it when I close my eyes. A few stone houses, a church with a broken steeple, and fields torn apart by shell fire. We were ordered to push through it at dawn, clear out any German armor, and hold until reinforcements arrived. The word was that the Krauts were regrouping after losing a Tiger the day before, the same one we'd taken out. That thought put a target on our backs before the fight even started. Revenge always finds its way to the front lines. The road leading into the village was narrow and lined with trees. Every shadow looked like a gun barrel. I sat in the commander's seat, scanning through the periscope as Turner guided us forward. The engine hummed low, the tracks clanking against broken cobblestone. Harris was ready on the gun, O'Malley beside him, quiet and tense. None of us spoke. The silence was heavier than any words could carry. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. Then, just as suddenly, came the crack of a rifle. The windshield of the Jeep ahead of us shattered, and the driver slumped over the wheel. "Sniper!" someone shouted. Turner hit the brakes, and the world erupted. Machine gun fire tore through the hedges on both sides. I yelled for smoke. Harris fired the coaxial, stitching the trees with .30 caliber rounds, while O'Malley cranked out the smoke grenades. The white clouds billowed around us, swallowing the road in seconds. Bullets pinged off the armor like hail on a tin roof. Turner pushed us forward, grinding through the fog, every foot feeling like a mile. I could feel my heart beating in my throat. We burst through the smoke and into the village square, straight into hell. A Panzer IV was waiting by the church, its gun already aimed. I didn't think, I just shouted, "Fire!" Harris slammed the trigger, and the Sherman lurched as our shell screamed across the square. It hit the Panzer on the turret, sending sparks flying but no penetration. "Load AP!" I yelled. O'Malley rammed another shell in, his hands moving fast despite the shaking. The Panzer's gun flashed, and a second later the whole tank rocked violently. The impact threw me against the hatch. For a split second, everything went white. The shell had hit the side armor. No penetration. By some miracle. Turner was screaming something about the engine. I could smell burning oil. "We're still moving," he shouted. "Barely." The Panzer fired again, missed. Harris took the shot. Direct hit. This time, the shell punched through the front plate. The Panzer lit up like a torch, flames spilling out the hatch. Men jumped from the top, their uniforms on fire, and collapsed before they hit the ground. I didn't let myself look for long. You couldn't. The second you started thinking about who they were, you froze. You couldn't afford that. Not here. We pushed deeper into the village. Every window looked alive. Every corner held danger. Infantry moved alongside us, darting between cover, shouting to one another. One of them, a sergeant named Cafferty, climbed onto our hull to direct us around a barricade. He slapped the side of the turret, yelling, "Tank to the left! At the bakery!" I swung the periscope and saw the muzzle of another German gun peeking from between two buildings. Harris was faster this. One shot, the wall collapsed, and the gun went silent. Cafferty jumped off, waved his men forward. The smoke, the noise, the heat, it all blended into one long blur of motion and fear. At one point, we stopped near the fountain in the square to cover advancing troops. A mortar round landed close, showering us with debris. Something struck the hull, loud enough to rattle my teeth. O'Malley swore he heard a whine from the rear. "Engine's leaking," he shouted. Turner checked the gauges, oil pressure dropping. I knew we couldn't stay there long. "We finish this fast," I said. "Then we pull back." Harris nodded, sweat dripping down his temple. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in an hour. Then we heard it, the unmistakable roar of heavy treads. Not a Panzer IV this time, heavier, slower, meaner. "Tiger," Harris muttered. The same sound that freezes your blood before you even see it. The infantry started shouting over the radios, calling out bearings. "East Road, Tiger coming through the alley." I looked through the periscope and saw the monster emerge from behind two houses, its long barrel swinging toward us. The beast was covered in mud and dust, like something crawling out of the earth itself. We fired first. The shell hit dead center and bounced off like a pebble. The Tiger didn't even flinch. It turned its gun toward us, deliberate, almost lazy, like it already knew how this would end. "Reverse! Reverse!" I screamed. Turner threw the tank into gear, treads grinding backward. The Tiger fired. The world exploded. The blast hit close, too close, blowing out part of the building beside us and showering us with bricks. The Sherman tilted, one tread catching in the rubble. We were stuck. "Get her out, Turner!" I yelled. He tried. The engine screamed, metal clanking, but the tread wouldn't move. "We're jammed!" he shouted. The Tiger's gun moved again. I knew we had seconds. "Harris," I said quietly. "He's shell. Load and fire through the bakery wall. Aim for the corner." He didn't question it. O'Malley slammed the shell in. Harris lined the shot. The Tiger was turning. I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. Fire! The Sherman shook as the shell tore through the bakery wall, smashing through brick and timber. Dust filled the air. Then, a metallic clang, a scream of twisting steel. The Tiger's turret jerked sideways, stuck. The wall we'd hit had collapsed onto it, pinning part of its gun. Again, I shouted. Another shell, another explosion, flames. The Tiger's engine roared, trying to move, but it couldn't. The alley filled with smoke and debris. For a moment, no one spoke. Just the hiss of fire, the groan of metal. Harris let out a shaky laugh. "You did it again," he said, voice cracking. I didn't answer. My hands were shaking too much to even grip the radio. Turner finally got the tread loose, and we reversed into cover behind what was left of a stable. We stayed there, breathing hard, listening to the battle fade. The Tiger burned behind the bakery, black smoke curling into the grey morning sky. It wasn't until hours later, when the shooting stopped, that I crawled out of the hatch. My ears were ringing, my face caked in soot. Around us, the village was in ruins. The bakery, the church, the fountain, all broken. I remember thinking how it had all looked so peaceful on the map. Now it was just another scar on the earth, another place the war had swallowed whole. We didn't talk much after that. Harris cleaned the gun in silence. O'Malley checked the ammo. Turner fixed what he could on the engine, humming under his breath, his voice shaking. I climbed down and walked a few steps toward the square. The Tiger was still there, a twisted skeleton. I thought about the men inside, about how fast their laughter must have turned to screams, and I hated that I could still hear both. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. It stays in your head, echoing, waiting for the quiet to come, so it can whisper again. That night, Saint-Martin was nothing but ruins and smoke. The fires still burned in the distance, flickering like dying stars behind the broken walls. The air was thick with ash, too heavy to breathe without tasting death in it. We parked Lola by what was left of the old church, its steeple shattered and bell lying half buried in the mud. Nobody said much. Nobody had to. You could feel it in the silence, that strange, trembling quiet that always came after chaos, the kind where your ears still ring from the noise, and yet the absence of it feels worse. I climbed out of the hatch and sat on the turret, staring at the orange glow beyond the rooftop. Turner was asleep inside, head slumped against the driver's controls. Harris was cleaning the 50, his hands moving slow and deliberate, as if ritual could keep the world from falling apart. O'Malley smoked in silence, eyes fixed on the distance. The kid hadn't said a word since the Tiger went up in flames. I knew why. We'd all watched men burn that day, and there's no prayer that makes that sight right. The infantry had moved on to secure the outskirts, but a few of them stayed behind. One of them, a medic named Rowe, walked past us carrying a stretcher. On it lay one of our own. I think his name was Jensen, from B Company. I'd seen him the day before, laughing near the fuel truck, telling some joke about home. Now he was wrapped in a blanket, face pale, his boots still muddy. Rowe nodded to me as he passed, the kind of nod that says, "There's nothing left to do." I nodded back, because what else can you do? We didn't eat that night, didn't have the stomach for it. Instead, we sat there, letting the firelight dance across the steel of our tank. I ran my hand along the armor, scarred, dented, burned, but still standing. Lola had taken everything thrown at her and kept us alive. She felt less like a machine and more like some stubborn beast refusing to die. I whispered a quiet thanks to her under my breath, the way a man might to a horse that's carried him through hell. Sometime after midnight, Harris spoke up. "You ever think about what happens to them?" he asked. "The Germans, the ones we hit." His voice cracked on the last word. I didn't answer right away. I'd been thinking about it all day. The way the Tiger's turret had jammed, the fire that followed, the screams that had echoed through the smoke before fading into nothing. "Yeah," I finally said. "I think about it more than I want to." He nodded, still staring into the dark. "They're just like us, aren't they?" he said softly. "Same fear, same orders, just on the wrong side of the line." There was truth in that, more than I could admit out loud. Because if you start seeing the enemy as human, every pull of the trigger feels heavier. But pretending they're not doesn't make it easier either. War turns you into something you don't recognize. A man who survives by shutting doors inside himself, one by one, until all that's left is instinct. You tell yourself it's duty, that it's for the greater good. But when the noise stops and the smoke clears, you're left alone with the ghosts you created. Around dawn, the fog came back, thicker than before, rolling through the ruins like a tide. It made everything look soft, almost peaceful, if you ignored the bodies and the wreckage. I watched it swallow the tiger's remains until it was just a shadow in the mist. That's when I realized something. That tank, that enemy we feared so much, was nothing but twisted metal now. The men inside were gone, but their fear, their laughter, their last breath, all of it lingered in that fog. The same fog that covered our dead, our fears, our sins. I thought about home, about my mother's kitchen, about the smell of coffee and bread in the morning, about the sound of the radio playing jazz. It felt like another lifetime. I used to think coming home would be the hardest part, but sitting there, watching the fog roll through the ruins, I knew the truth. The hardest part was realizing I'd already left parts of myself behind, pieces buried somewhere in this shattered village, in the fields of Normandy, in every shell we fired. Turner woke up coughing, rubbing his eyes. "What time is it?" he asked. "Too early," I said. He climbed out, stretched, and looked around. "We still breathing?" he said, with a tired grin. Guess that's something. It was. But survival started to feel less like a blessing, and more like a debt we'd never finish paying. Later that morning, new orders came down. We were to move east again, toward another line, another village waiting to be reduced to dust. I could hear the engines warming up, the familiar growl that meant the cycle was starting again. Before we rolled out, I climbed onto the turret one last time and looked back at Saint-Martin. The air was quiet, too quiet. Somewhere under that fog lay everything we'd done, every shot, every scream, every laugh that had died too soon. As we moved out, the tracks crushed what was left of the cobblestones, grinding them into the mud. The sound echoed through the ruins like a heartbeat fading away. Harris turned to me, his face drawn, eyes hollow. "You think it ever ends?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. Not really. Because deep down, I knew the truth. The war might end on paper, but not in us. It follows you home, hides behind every quiet moment, waiting for you to remember. That morning, the fog lifted as we reached the edge of the village. The sun broke through, weak but steady, painting everything gold. For a second, it looked almost beautiful, like the world was trying to forgive itself. But forgiveness isn't something the earth gives easily. You have to live with what you've done, and what you've lost, and what you've become. That's the real weight of it. Tell me something. Have you ever carried a memory that won't let you go? Drop it in the comments. Just write, "Yes, I know that weight." We moved east for 2 days, passing through towns that all looked the same. Grey ruins, silent streets, the faint smell of smoke and death that never left. The names blurred together after a while. Saint something, Lur, whatever. Each one another scar carved into the land. The trees along the roads had their limbs torn away by shellfire, and the fields were littered with twisted metal and the ghosts of tanks, German and American alike. Some still burned when we passed, black columns of smoke rising into the sky like accusations. Every mile I could feel something hollow growing inside me, a space that used to hold fear, but now only carried exhaustion. We stopped in a small village whose name I can't remember, just a handful of stone houses and a barn still standing. There were civilians there, women, old men, a few children. They stared at us as we rolled in, eyes wide and blank, like people who had seen too much to react anymore. A little girl waved at me from behind her mother's skirt. Her hand was trembling. I waved back. She smiled, just barely. It was the first honest smile I'd seen in weeks. I don't know why, but that moment cut deeper than any bullet, because it reminded me what we were fighting for, and at the same time, what we were destroying. We set up near the edge of town, using the barn as cover for the tanks. The infantry dug in along the road. I climbed down from Lola and stretched, my back aching from days of sitting in that metal coffin. Harris was cleaning the main gun again, even though it didn't need it. Turner was checking the engine, muttering about how it sounded worse every mile. O'Malley sat on an ammo crate, smoking and staring into the distance. None of us talked much anymore. Words felt too small for what we carried. That night, a local farmer brought us bread and soup. He didn't speak English, but I could see in his eyes the gratitude, the fear, the pain. His house had been shelled, his wife gone. Only his daughter and his old dog left. He pointed at the tank, said something I didn't understand, then put his hand over his heart and nodded. I nodded back. When he left, Harris whispered, "He probably thinks we're heroes." I didn't answer. I didn't feel like. Heroes don't leave towns in ashes. Heroes don't see what we've seen and keep breathing. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, I took a walk through the fields. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the grass. The air was cold, clean in a way it hadn't been in weeks. For a moment, I almost felt at peace. But then I saw the wreckage of a German half-track near the tree line. The smell hit me first. That awful mix of oil, burnt rubber, and death. I walked closer. against my better judgment. Inside were 3 bodies, or what was left of them. One of them was slumped over the wheel, a photograph clutched in his hand. I couldn't see the face in the photo, just a small figure, maybe a wife, maybe a child. I stood there for a long time, the cold wind biting at my neck. Then I turned and walked away. Back at the barn, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that photograph. It looked too much like the one Turner kept taped to his dashboard. Same small hope trapped in a picture. I realized then that war doesn't care about sides. It only knows how to take. It takes your friends, your enemies, your faith, and leaves you with ghosts that wear familiar faces. The next morning, the girl from before came by again. She handed me a flower, a small crushed daisy, and said something in French I couldn't understand. I smiled, or tried to. She ran off before I could say anything. I held that flower for a while, thinking about my sister back home, how she used to pick wildflowers by the fence in our yard. Funny how a single fragile thing could feel heavier than all the steel we carried. Harris saw me with it and laughed softly. "You getting sentimental on me, Captain?" he said. I told him maybe I was. He shook his head. "You keep that up, you'll start feeling again." He said it as a joke, but there was truth in it. Feeling was dangerous out here. It got men killed. It made you hesitate when you needed to act, so most of us learned to bury it, deep and quiet. But sometimes, something small, a flower, a photograph, a smile, cracks the armor. That evening, I sat on top of Lola, watching the sunset. The sky turned red and gold, the kind of color you don't forget. Turner climbed up beside me, lit a cigarette, and passed it over. We sat there in silence, the smoke curling between us. "You ever think about what we'll do when it's over?" he asked. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "I think about it every damn day," I said. "But I don't know if we ever really leave this behind." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me neither." The sun dipped low, and the shadows stretched long over the field. I felt the wind change, colder, sharper. Somewhere out there, the guns were still rumbling, faint but steady. The war kept moving, even when we didn't. And I realized then that peace wasn't something waiting for us at the end. It was something we'd have to build from the pieces left of who we were. After that night, something in me began to change. It wasn't sudden, like a switch flipping, but slow, quiet, like rust creeping across steel. I stopped seeing the war as a place I was in and started feeling it as something that had moved into me. Every sound, every smell, every silence carried a memory. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see home anymore. I saw flashes, fire through fog, faces I couldn't save, men calling for medics who never came. The war wasn't around me now, it was inside me. We kept moving, town to town, field to field. The front never really felt like a line, more like a storm that drifted, unpredictable and merciless. Sometimes we'd win ground, sometimes we'd lose it, but every inch cost something we could never take back. I began writing in a small notebook I carried in my jacket, just fragments, a name, a thought, a smell. It wasn't to remember, it was to make sure I didn't forget who I was before this. Because the longer we fought, the more that man began to fade. One night, while we were bivouacked near a river, I woke to the sound of Harris having a nightmare. He was shaking, muttering, trapped somewhere back in that village where we'd burned the tiger. I reached over and shook his shoulder. He woke up gasping, eyes wild, drenched in sweat. "You're okay," I told him. "You're here." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. None of us were really here anymore. Part of us was still out there, in those ruins, replaying it over and over. Harris just nodded, lit a cigarette with trembling hands, and stared into the... I didn't sleep again that. Turner started talking less after. He'd hum sometimes the same tune over and over, something slow and sad, maybe from home. One morning, I found him sitting by the tank, staring at the picture of his fiancée. He said, "You think she'd still recognize me now?" I didn't know how to answer. We'd all changed, not in the way you grow older or tougher, but in the way metal changes when it's been through fire, still solid, but never the same. The landscape changed as we moved east, flatter, quieter. The fighting eased for a while, but that almost made it worse. The silence felt wrong. It gave us time to think, to feel, and feeling was dangerous. I'd sit inside the Sherman at night, engine off, staring at the periscope glass, and sometimes I'd see reflections that weren't there, flashes of faces in the dark, voices whispering my name. I knew they weren't real, but part of me didn't want them to go away, because as long as I heard them, it meant they weren't forgotten. One evening, O'Malley handed me a small piece of shrapnel he'd found wedged in the armor. "Keep it," he said, "a souvenir." It was jagged, still stained with oil and soot. I carried it in my pocket from then on, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that we'd survived something, that we'd walked through fire and somehow kept walking. But survival isn't the same as when the letters from home finally caught up with us. I couldn't bring myself in mine. I watched Turner tear his open, smiling at the sight of handwriting that belonged to him. Harris read his slowly, his lips moving over every word like he was afraid to break them. O'Malley's letter was short. His mother had passed. He didn't speak for 2 days after that. When I finally opened mine, all it said was, "We miss you. Please come home safe." I stared at those words until they blurred. Safe. I didn't even know what that meant anymore. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if the Germans we fought had letters like that waiting for them too. If their mothers wrote the same prayers, if their sweethearts counted the days the way ours did, the thought haunted me more than the fighting ever could. Because in that realization, the whole idea of sides started to fade. All that was left were men caught in the same storm, each trying to get home to someone who might not even be there when it was over. By then, the war had begun to feel endless, not just in time, but in weight. Every step forward pressed down harder, every victory felt smaller, but I kept moving, because that's what soldiers do. You move, you fight, you endure, until one day, you look around and realize you've been carrying the ghosts longer than the gun. That night by the river, I threw the piece of shrapnel into the water. It sank without a sound. I told myself it was time to let go of something, even if I didn't know what. But as I watched the ripples fade, I realized you don't get to choose what stays with you. The war decides that for you. I'm an old man now. My hands shake when I pour my morning coffee, and my knees ache when the weather turns cold. But there are nights when I wake up and I swear I can still feel the rumble of Lola's engine and hear Harris tapping the breech 3 times before every shot. Smell the burned oil and mud that clung to everything we own. It's been decades, but the war doesn't leave you. It just learns to whisper instead of scream. People like to ask me what it was like, what it felt like, being in those tanks, facing those odds. I tell them the truth, even if they don't believe it. It wasn't courage that kept us going. It was fear. Fear of dying, fear of failing the men beside you, fear of being the one who didn't pull his weight. And sometimes it was love. Not the kind they write about in letters or movies, but a quieter kind. The kind you feel when you see your buddy crawling out of a burning tank and you'd rather die than let him be alone. That's the kind of love war gives you, the kind that hurts to remember. After the war, they sent us home like nothing had happened. I remember stepping off the ship, the smell of salt still in my clothes, and hearing people cheer, flags waving, bands playing, mothers crying. But all I could think about was the sound of silence in Saint-Martin, the fog rolling over the Tiger's wreck, the flower that little girl gave me. Everyone said we'd won, but I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like a man who had seen too much to ever see the world the same way again. For years, I didn't talk about it. I worked, I drank, I pretended. I'd wake up sweating some night, sure I could hear the clang of treads or the scream of a shell. My wife would ask what was wrong, and I'd tell her it was just a dream. But they weren't dreams. They were memories replaying themselves, sharp and alive. I'd smell diesel in the street, or hear thunder rolling in the distance and be right back in that French field, watching the fog move like smoke. Time doesn't heal things, it just teaches you how to hide them better. When Harris died, I went to his funeral. It was small. No uniforms, no flags. Just his family, a few old friends, and me. His wife told me he never talked about the war either. She said he'd sit on the porch some nights, staring at the horizon, humming a tune she didn't recognize. I knew it instantly, Turner's tune, the same one he used to hum by the tank when things got quiet. I didn't tell her. I just stood there, listening to the wind, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry. Not for Harris, not for Turner or O'Malley, but for all of us, for the boys we were and the men the war made us become. I've visited Normandy a few times since then. The fields are green again now, the villages rebuilt. Kids ride their bikes down the same roads we once bled across. I've stood by the hedgerows where we first fought and felt the wind move through the grass. And for a moment, I could almost believe it's all been forgiven. Almost. But there's a kind of peace that doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from remembering and still choosing to live. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do it all again. I don't have a simple answer. I loved my country. I did what I had to do. But I also learned that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It just changes shape. It lives in the hearts of those who come home, in the quiet spaces no one else can see. The Germans laughed at my Sherman once, called it weak, said it would burn easy. Maybe they were right, but that tank kept us alive. It carried our fear, our hope, our grief, everything we were too afraid to say out loud. And when it was all over, it left me with one truth I still hold close. Courage isn't surviving the fire. It's living after it. If you've listened all the way through, if this story stayed with you even for a moment, give it a like and subscribe. Not for me, but for the men who never got to come home, whose laughter and fear are still out there somewhere, in the fog, waiting to be remembered.